Okay, congratulations. Welcome to the last chapter of the course where we're going to be working with APIs for the first time. So what is an API? Well, an API stands for an Application Programming Interface. And you're saying, okay, that's great. I now know what an API stands for, but what is it? Well, what we can do when we're creating applications sometimes is send a request somewhere else to get data, okay? And then we get that data back. So for example, you might make a weather app whereby you send a request to get data from an API somewhere, and it might send back whether it is raining or not in Houston, Texas. Okay, that is an example of a request being sent to an API and a response being sent back. If you were to ever make a YouTube clone, maybe with a front-end framework such as React, you might also have to send a request to an API, maybe for example the YouTube API, and get the videos back in the form of JSON. So in this chapter of the course, we're going to learn about GET requests, how to send a request to an API, the data format that it comes back in. But first we have to understand the difference between asynchronous and synchronous JavaScript. So what we've covered in this course so far is synchronous JavaScript. That is the idea that things happen one at a time. So JavaScript is a synchronous programming language whereby tasks or operations are executed one line after the other in a sequential manner. So we saw this, for example, when we were logging out things to the console. If we were to run this code, we would have the statement, I'm the first line of code execute, followed by I am the second line of code, followed by the third line of code, okay? One of the downfalls or disadvantages of synchronous code is that if there is a mistake somewhere, one line of code can block the rest of the operation from running. We saw that whenever we had a typo, for example, if I was trying to access a variable that didn't work, the whole script file essentially would just stop working, okay? So synchronous is the whole idea that tasks are executed one at a time. So for example, building a house, maybe you need to chop down the tree, I need to turn it into timber, and then our friend actually, puts the timber onto the roof. That would be basically an example of a synchronous operation where you have to chop down the tree, I have to wait for you before I can make the timber bars, and then our friend has to wait for me to provide them with the timber or the lumber in a certain way for them to use the nails and hammer it onto the roof of a house. Okay, so it is synchronous. Asynchronous JavaScript is the idea that code can take some time to run, but typically what it means is that multiple tasks can happen at the same time. So for example, in the real world, making a Big Mac, believe it or not, can be an example of asynchronous because one person might be toasting the buns at one time while simultaneously someone is cooking the meat. Then of course the buns are handed to the person who dresses them, but you might have a situation where while the burger is cooking, we're actually toasting the buns and doing the dressing then. Okay, so that's two tasks happening at the same time. So that is the idea behind asynchronous. It's the idea that multiple things can be happening at the same time, so not necessarily in a sequential manner. So for example, you might be making an application and the first statement is executed. Then we move on to the second statement, statement 2, but maybe that is a piece of code that sends a request to an API and we're waiting to get data back. So if we write our code in an asynchronous manner, what happens is instead of waiting for us to get a response from the API to then go on and do the third task, we make our code so that, okay, while we're waiting for a response for statement 2, let's go on and do the third task, okay? So this is the whole idea behind asynchronous JavaScript. It's basically non-blocking. If you're sending a request to an API to do something, you don't need to wait for a response before doing something else. You can continue to execute operations in your JavaScript file. So the benefits of asynchronous JavaScript is that we can start running some code, but not have to wait for it to finish before going on to do something else. Like I just said, maybe you're sending a request to an API to get back, a song or a video, but while you're waiting for that, you're doing something else, okay? And it is the whole idea that the execution of tasks in JavaScript or statements are not dependent on each other. So this conceptually doesn't make a whole lot of sense until we actually see the code. Key point about this part of the course, we're going to start working with APIs. We're going to learn what JSON is, GET requests. So just one key takeaway from this tutorial, try understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript. Synchronous is the idea that tasks are executed one after the other. Task 1, then task 2, then task 3. If there is a mistake or an error somewhere, task 3 cannot happen until task 2 executes. Task 2 cannot happen until we've completed task 1. Asynchronous JavaScript is different. It is the idea that we can perform multiple operations simultaneously or at the same time, so they're not necessarily executed in a sequential manner. We might do task 1, then we start task 2. Task 2 is currently ongoing while we're waiting for a response, but we don't wait for a response to go on and execute task 3. So that is the key difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript. Synchronous JavaScript is what we've seen so far in this course. Tasks are executed one after the other. Things happen one at a time in a sequential manner. But with asynchronous, multiple tasks can happen at once. Okay, so for example, I don't know if anyone's seen Loki on Disney Plus, but me and you in our lives, that's all happened in a sequential way, I suppose you could say. You might do one thing and then do something else and then do something else, where with the multiverse theory, there are potentially multiple things happening at the same time. Also, even in our current timeline, if I went down and made a cup of tea, maybe I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, but I'm also cooking beans at the same time. That would be me performing asynchronous tasks, basically doing two tasks at the same time, not waiting for one to finish before doing the other. But conceptually, it's hard to really get a grasp of this until we actually see it in action. So I'm going to end the tutorial there, and I'll see you in the next one. We need to understand the difference, of course, between synchronous and asynchronous and what they are for us to work with APIs. Okay, awesome. See you in the next one.